So thank you guys so much for giving up your lunch and for coming to my mini PD on vocabulary interventions. So I have an agenda for you guys. That could also be used as a notes page if you want to take any notes, but you certainly don't have to. So as you guys know, over the last 3 or 4 months, I've been doing some research on vocabulary intervention because diagnostic after diagnostic, assessment after assessment has shown that that's a major struggle for our students. I already has many of them on a second or third grade academic vocabulary level, which is a huge issue for them in terms of all of their classes. And they're just simply not able to access grade level concepts and grade level activities even because of their lack of language skills. So the first thing I want to talk about is some of the results of my action research, which you guys were a part of, but there were also some other teachers who were a part of it, so you might be kind of interested or surprised by the results. The first trend that I noticed, mostly through the surveys, but also through the interview process, was that teachers at BCMS have a very similar attitude towards vocabulary, which I was kind of shocked by. But across the board, ELA, math, science, the only content area we don't have is social studies, but across the other subjects, and including an ESL specialist, every teacher cited vocabulary as being incredibly important to students. Most teachers at BCMS, which might surprise you, are including vocabulary already in their daily instruction and in their lesson plans. But as we get to the instructional methods, we'll talk about some of the ways that those things are or aren't working according to the participants. So teachers agree that vocabulary should be addressed and needs to be taught, especially for our students, which brings us to the student needs, which I already kind of talked about. But many of the participants, about 6 out of 7 of the survey participants, said that they feel that vocabulary is an obstacle to students learning every day or most days. And that's all 3 tiers of vocabulary. So that's tier 1, which is just basic, everyday conversational vocabulary, knowing synonyms for some simple words, such as, instead of calling it a curtain and a shade, those are 2 similar things, they might have slightly different connotative meanings, but students are not able to kind of interchange those words or associate the same types of things with them. They also struggle with tier 2 vocabulary, which is academic vocabulary kind of in general. So a lot of the words that we would put in our questions, things like describe, evaluate, analyze, and if they're not able to access what those words mean, they'll never be able to do the question or answer the question appropriately. And then lastly, tier 3 would be the very content-specific words. So something like mitosis or something like parabola, right? That's something that's specific to a content. It's a higher level word, but in order for them to do well in that subject on their grade level, they need to know the specific words as well. And they're struggling across the board in conversation, in their writing. Just in the things that teachers are overhearing, students don't use very descriptive or a wide expanse of vocabulary. Why do you guys think that is?
Why they don't have a wide expanse of vocabulary? We have talked about it. I think it's because there was very little academic or vocabulary instruction or vocabulary thank you. They weren't exposed to a lot of vocabulary starting in their earliest years, and then it just kind of snowballs so that it becomes increasingly more difficult to introduce vocabulary development skills as they get older and really less successful in their work as years go on.
Absolutely, and I know that's something that you've noticed working with adolescent students. That's something that all the research supports, that kids absorb language around them in the way that they're spoken to and interacted with, in the experiences they have, and just with limited experiences, especially for students living in poverty, they just don't have the exposure, they just don't have the access to that language. And even if they do have the access, they might not be getting the type of feedback that they need in order to really internalize that language. So it's not quite sticking. That's another trend. A lot of teachers said that like students might understand the word for that lesson, but it's not sticking. When they're assessing that word in the future, kids are going back to not really knowing it and not really understanding it. And we can talk about kind of why that is, which brings us to the instructional methods. So although every teacher said that vocabulary is important, none of the teachers who participated really have a strong or a certain sense of how to teach and assess vocabulary. So some teachers mentioned word study in the sense that like they have a word wall, but the kids aren't really assessed or quizzed on the word wall. Or maybe they do give vocabulary quizzes, but that it's something like a matching quiz where the students aren't really engaging and using the word. And pretty much everyone identified as not being sure, and neither am I, which is why I started this project, because it's obviously an issue that we're having, and I feel like as a school and from our administration, there's not enough of a focus on how to teach vocabulary. And even with the research, there's tons of strategies for elementary school students, and by the time it gets to middle school students, the strategies have dropped off. It's really kind of a sense of, well, it's too late. If they didn't receive that development, they didn't receive that support when they were little, they're just always going to be behind. And that's true unless we figure out something that can help kind of remediate those issues and can help them overcome that. Which brings us to part 2, unless you guys have any questions about any of the trends or any of what went on during the research.
The only question I have is, so 100% of teachers said that they do not have consistent vocabulary structures. Was it 100%, or is there anybody that you found that was like, no?
People mentioned trying a number of structures and having more success with some than others. For example, studying word parts is being done in science, it's being done in ELA, it's being done with special ed, L, and general ed students, but it's not being done, I don't think, on a consistent enough basis that students know when it comes to seeing a word they don't understand, that they have enough of a background, enough of an understanding at this point to use those skills themselves. So it's starting. I mean, and teachers are finding that effective, but other teachers mentioned, well, I tried Fair Model and it didn't really work. I tried word parts and it didn't really work. I tried flip cards or index cards and they didn't really work. We use iReady, but we don't think that works. So everyone seemed, from my understanding, to be searching for a best practice or something that they can rely on.
And then you had mentioned that within the scholarship there are some things that align to like the funding of your school, but how would you compare the trends that you found to like the scholarship that you were doing beyond what you spoke about like the issue?
For our community, our students are completely normal. I mean, a lot of it is based on socioeconomic status. There are a lot of statistics around race, but I don't, in my own perspective, think it's as much about race as it is socioeconomic status. If it happens to be that we work in a community that's African American and poor, then yes, it is about African American students, but it's much more about attitudes towards education as a whole, opportunities, parents' own literacy. So if you're in a community where parents aren't highly literate or highly invested in school as being like something they value, it's very hard for the kids to pick that up. So we're not an outlier. This isn't something that is necessarily our fault, but it is something that we're responsible for addressing.
Do you happen to know, in terms of like instructional methods, I guess, across the city, do you happen to know if other secondary schools struggle with the same trends, teachers don't know how to address it, stuff like that?
Absolutely. I can't speak countrywide, but in terms of our city, there's definitely, this is a definite need, and I think the DOE is trying to respond. Earlier this year, they released an information kind of packet online. You can find the PDF, and I can send that to you guys, about vocabulary instruction, about instructional practices, about assessment practices, about why it's so important. And that message is, from what I understand, being sent by the DOE, but it's not quite made its way into schools yet. A lot of teachers are kind of responsible on their own for incorporating vocabulary. Many content area teachers feel like it's the ELA teacher's responsibility, which I think to some extent it is, but at the point of middle school, no matter what you teach, if you have a kid who can't learn because they don't understand the words, I think it becomes everyone's issue. You mentioned the standards don't value vocabulary.
That was the next thing I was going to ask is, in that packet or any other scholarship, is there anyone addressing the inconsistency with the standards and the meaning?
Not that I've seen. I mean, there's many, many articles written by teachers, written by professionals, curriculum developers, but it's not being enacted yet. Sure. So, in terms of intervention practices that work, I've done a lot of research, and some I think are definitely more effective than others, but they break down into 3 types of instruction. And I'm getting this from this book, which I've actually asked Ms. Walsh to get us next year. We'll see how that goes. But it's called Vocabulary Their Way. It's word study, especially for middle and secondary students. And it's broken down into these 3 kind of categories of instruction. The first of which, and we're on part 2B, we're going to go back to A. We haven't gotten to that yet. But the word-specific instruction is when you teach a particular targeted word because of a need. So you guys can see today in my class we talked about perspective and we talked about perception. Those are 2 words that I wanted my students to know for this lesson. We studied the words. We used them in a number of ways. We talked about them. But that's not something that's necessary to ELA. It's something that was necessary for today's lesson. So that would be word study. There's context-based instruction, which is when you're teaching words based on a context in which they're used. For example, if you're teaching a unit on World War II, there's a lot of words that are specific to that unit that would need to be taught. So this isn't about teaching methods, it's just about the way that we teach words. And then the third one is word consciousness, and this is kind of the most holistic or comprehensive approach, which is when you're teaching word parts, you're teaching the history of words, you're teaching parts of speech, you're teaching connotation versus denotation, and basically all of that falls under morphology or morphological studies. Yes?
Is Wilson considered that?
I don't know anything about Wilson. What is it like? What is the program?
It's learning phonetics and phonological awareness.
Yes, that's absolutely part of morphological studies. It might be morphology for spelling or morphology for fluency instead of morphology for vocabulary, but that would definitely fall under morphology. And so there's nothing wrong with each of these. There's no better or worse, but they're just kind of different ways of approaching vocabulary. So in your own classroom or in your own content, which type of word study do you think might be the most effective, or maybe all of them?
I think that I use mostly word-specific instruction or context-based instruction in math. So we give them vocabulary words based on the skill that we're learning. So we introduce those vocabulary words because that is literally everything we're talking about.
Yeah, so in order to understand the lessons day to day, or even the mini lessons to the guided practice, independent practice, they need those words. Absolutely. How about you, Alex?
I actually think that word consciousness is probably the most fundamental because it's tough because it depends. Is it vocabulary for reading purposes or is it vocabulary for speaking and listening and writing purposes? Because then it would be word consciousness wouldn't necessarily be as important if we're just focusing on speaking and listening, but I also, as a visual learner, one can understand a word once one understands the parts and the background behind the word, so then they can draw those connections. So it's tough. I don't have the answer, but I immediately respond to word consciousness parts of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're all important. They're all useful. And when we're faced with a need like we are faced with, where it's not just tier 3 words, right? It's not, kids aren't just struggling with the most difficult, most specific words. They're struggling with everything. So in order to really help them and support them, it needs to be all 3. But I do think each of the 3 kind of has its own place or has its own area where it's best suited. Excuse me. All right. So to go to intervention practices that work, there are a million, and I haven't tested them all. So when I say that they work, that's kind of research-based and based on my understanding, but not saying that they will 100% work for you every single time. But according to a lot of research, in order for vocabulary interventions to be successful with middle school kids, it has to be a complete submersion in language in all of their classes. Like, vocabulary can't stand alone. It can't be taught one period a week for 45 minutes with a list of words that you're pulling from. That simply does not work. It's not effective. Students need to be made aware that language gives them access to the world around them, and in that way it becomes more meaningful. So the practices may be different, the purposes.
Can you repeat that beautiful sentence again?
I don't remember it.
Students are aware of something about language being
That it gives them access to the world around them, right? They're old enough at this point that we're not just, it's not a spelling test where you're just giving them something to memorize and expecting them to regurgitate it at you. If we want them to come to value this, if we want them to be lifelong learners and word enthusiasts and people who see this as being purposeful, it has to be purposeful in our instruction and for us as well, right? So even in modeling and getting excited about new words, or in showing students that you come across words that you don't understand, but that you seek out in order to help you better grasp whatever it is that's going on around you, you're modeling that practice of that language isn't something that can be isolated, that's only taught in one class, that's only taught for 15 minutes and then quizzed on, but that it's part of the way that we come to understand and express ourselves in the world. And there are, like I said, a lot of practices, but because we are so very short on time, I want to show you one that I think can be used in any subject for a number of reasons and would be pretty successful. So in actuality, if I was doing this with my students, I would go to the hardware store and get paint strips. You know, the strips of with the different color gradients. So that it's tactile, it's engaging. I've seen classrooms where they put a whole stack of them on a key ring, and every kid or every desk has their own. So it's something that they're kind of in control of and they have ownership of. And it can be used, as I said, in a number of ways. I'm going to put this up on the projector just to show you a few examples of how these could be used. So the first, most basic way to use paint chips to help grow vocabulary would be to list synonyms. And like we said, our students struggle with descriptive language, so it could be something like a gradient of meaning, where first you have a pretty basic word, for example, happy, and then they find 3 synonyms or even antonyms, depending on what the purpose is, to help grow their vocabulary. This would probably be most useful in an ELA setting where they're doing some creative writing or some essay writing, but I can see how it would be used elsewhere as well. There is, you can use them for concepts, so like Elle said, right, I forgot what that thing was called, statistical what?
descriptive
Measures of central tendency, which you might use different words for the kids, I have no idea, but where you're teaching a concept and they're going to have a bunch of words that relate to that concept, you want them to have one place to keep them, kind of like a glossary of terms, but again, a little more engaging. A third way that you could use this is if you are teaching word parts, which is, by research, like the most effective way to help them learn a lot of words quickly, rather than word study, which is helpful, but you're only teaching targeted words. If you teach affixes, roots, prefixes, suffixes, their vocabulary might expand more quickly. You could do something with a root. So in science, I know they were talking about the root hydro or hydra, meaning related to water, and then they could list a number of words that all share that root or that word part. Another way to use this, and also for parts of speech. So today we talked about the word perceive, which is a verb to become aware of, but then I know this is something I don't do in my teaching. I never talk about parts of speech. I'm sure if I asked my kids what an adjective was, they would have no idea. But this way, they kind of see how words interact and how their meaning changes depending on the part of speech. And the real paint chips are quite a bit bigger than this. So you can put sentences, and you can combine these all, right, if you wanted to. You could do a synonym, an antonym, a different part of speech, use it in a sentence, etc., etc. So I know this isn't like mind-blowing, oh my god, paint chips, my life will never be the same, but it's one tool that is versatile. It can be used to suit the needs of any content area. Our age kids, I don't think, would be too old for this. I think they would enjoy it, and it would give them a little more ownership over their vocabulary. And you can get them for free. I have classmates who went to Lowe's, went to Home Depot, and asked for paint chips for their classroom, and they gave them like stacks on stacks on stacks. Or you could always print them from this nice website, but these are not as cool, I don't think. What do you think? With this, is there any way that this might be useful?
I've heard of this before, and I love the way that you showed different variations on how to use it. So I have two questions for you. What if you were to do this? Is this like a personalized thing with each student is like kind of choosing it, or is this like how would you implement this in whole class to then like essentially collect the data without it being I have to look through thousands of paint chips. And then the second thing is with the paint chips, like do you put I see here how you have verb, noun, adjective, adjective, so I guess that's how you label them to show what's an antonym or synonym, because I was gonna ask how, if the kid is doing it in 4 different styles, like how do we ensure that they're not accidentally using antonyms or they're using synonyms and then accidentally incorrectly using a misconception?
For the second question, I probably wouldn't introduce all 4 uses. That was more because I want you to be able to access them in any subject, and I think they could be useful for different content areas with different reasons. And a lot of, again, the research shows that vocabulary has to be something that everyone is addressing, but at the same time, no teacher wants to be part of a prescribed curriculum where they're told, you have to do this every Tuesday at 2:15, you have to do it this way, you have to assess it this way, you have to track it this way, right? So this is a practice that if every teacher was using paint chips or a tool like this, the students would know what it meant, the students would be used to it, but it wouldn't be the same repetitive thing where teachers have something shoved down their throat, because I don't think that's ever effective. It makes the teachers much less interested and passionate. But at the same time, if they're going from classroom to classroom and vocabulary is being taught in a totally different way in every classroom, that could also be overwhelming. So it's just kind of like a little bit of consistency without dictating exactly what everyone's going to do. And in terms of the data, I don't think this is a tool I would grade. I think it's a tool the students would keep for reference. So if we're doing, when we did memoir and we did sensory details, and descriptive language, if we focus on synonyms and antonyms, the kids would have this at their desk, and then when they go to write their own memoir, you could say, like, conferencing with a student, I see you used good. Turn to your paint chip where we talked about all the synonyms for good and pick a more powerful word. Or turn and talk with your neighbor. Switch paint chip rings with your neighbor and see what words they had for good or what words they had for happy, to kind of just grow the tools that they had. Because a lot of the things I also saw was the stuff that teachers do. And like, that's great because teachers need to instruct and students need to learn. But what about making the students responsible or making them interested in their own, like, this is something they need. And I think once they start to understand, they can feel how limited their vocabulary is. Whether or not they have the words to say it or to express it, they know that they're constantly reading things that they don't understand, that they're constantly being spoken to with words that they just can't process, and we assume they can. And so I think it's important to teach them tools that they can then use on their own, which is my issue with context clues. So many teachers said they use context clues. I observed a few classrooms, I didn't see anyone talking about context clues. No one mentioned how they teach context clues, how they assess context clues, whether kids are using context clues on their own. It's just like seems to be this buzzword that everyone relies on, but it's just not that meaningful. So to have a tool that they can kind of self-regulate, I think is a little more meaningful.
On that, because this is something that I constantly worry about. You know, your data shows what we already know as the teachers, where they don't know tier 1 vocabulary. So how do you address a problem like that, where you are finding yourself, you know, in a large classroom with such a wide range of students, how do you then effectively give like a context clue thing for a word that reaches all the learners? You know what I mean?
Well, I think it's the same sort of differentiation as when we have independent reading. I mean, we teach skills using really low-level text. That's a practice that we share in order to help them with the concepts first. And then, as they move forward, they can all work on that at their own pace. I don't think there's an easy answer, and I don't think it's an easy problem to address. But I think at least at this point, we've recognized that everyone sees that something could be done to help the students, and that there are options out there, that we should be trying strategies, we should be talking about these in our meetings, because for everyone to say that it's important and then, oh, goodness, say it's important and then do nothing about it is obviously not helping.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have reflections for you guys, if you could give them back to me after school.